$600 buys you the smallest mini Quonset shell on the market, not a rendering, not a projection. A real, current price from active manufacturers. The corrugated arch panels ship flat, the ribs bolt together with no welding required, and a two-person crew with zero construction background can raise the full shell in a single weekend. This is not new technology chasing a trend. It is an 80-year-old Navy design, deployed more than 150,000 times across a world war, that has simply never left the surplus catalogs and government auction listings it retreated into after 1945. Meanwhile, the tiny home conversation online is dominated by shipping containers and trailer kits costing many multiples of this price. Nobody is asking the obvious question. Why has the cheapest, most battle-tested shelter shape in the country been standing in plain sight for 80 years, and almost nobody has noticed it? By the end of this video, you will know exactly why, and exactly what it actually costs. $58,000. That is the current median price for a finished tiny home on a trailer chassis from a production builder in the United States. Not a custom build, not a premium finish, the base model, standard trim before delivery, before the land, before a single utility hookup. 5 years ago, that number sat closer to 38,000. The trend is not correcting itself. It is accelerating, and it is accelerating while the regulatory environment around it has quietly been moving the other way. California, Montana, and Texas have all loosened their accessory dwelling unit rules since 2020. Rural county codes across the South and the Intermountain West have long exempted small structures from the permitting process entirely, provided they fall under a specific square footage threshold and are not tied into municipal water or sewer. The window most people assume is closed has been open for years. The obstacle was never the paperwork. The obstacle has always been the price of the structure itself. And that is exactly where the story gets strange. Here's a question almost nobody shopping for a small building thinks to ask. Not whether you can afford a tiny home, whether you have been pricing the right kind of structure at all. Something that could close that $58,000 gap has been sitting quietly in government surplus listings and agricultural supply catalogs for the better part of a century. It never left. It was never discontinued. It simply stopped being marketed to people looking for a house and started being marketed to farmers looking for a shed. Almost nobody in the tiny home conversation has noticed it, and the reason takes you somewhere you would not expect a housing answer to come from. Not a startup. Not a design studio. A naval engineering problem from 1941, solved under wartime pressure, for a purpose that had nothing to do with anyone's retirement plan or backyard office. What that problem demanded and how it was solved is where the real story starts. In 1941, the United States Navy sat down with a problem that had no existing solution on the shelf. It needed shelter that could be manufactured in bulk, broken down into flat panels, loaded onto a cargo ship, and assembled on a Pacific Island beach by a construction crew working against a deadline measured in hours, not days. The structure had to stand through tropical storms without failing. It had to be light enough to move without heavy equipment, and simple enough that any man holding a wrench could put together without ever reading a blueprint. The answer came from the George A. Fuller Company, working under Navy contract at Quonset Point Naval Air Station in Rhode Island. The name stuck the way a nickname sticks to a man who never asked for one. By the end of the war, roughly 150,000 Quonset huts had been built and deployed across every theater of the conflict, from the Aleutian Islands to North Africa, to the scattered islands of the South Pacific. Field hospitals, aircraft maintenance hangars, barracks, supply depots. The same arch served all of them because the same arch could be trusted to. When the war ended, surplus units won a government auction for as little as $1,000 each. They scattered across farms throughout the Midwest and the Great Plains, repurposed as equipment sheds, grain storage buildings, and in more than a few cases, as the primary structure on a small rural property. A number of them are still standing today, corrugated and unglamorous, doing the same job they were built to do 80 years ago. But something about that surplus pipeline never fully closed, and it is still running right now, which is where this gets interesting. The many models entering the civilian market today are not a reinterpretation of that design. They are direct descendants of it. the corrugated steel arch, the bolt-together rib assembly, the total absence of any internal load-bearing wall. All of it traces back to the same engineering logic the Navy was forced to perfect under wartime pressure in 1941. This was never a trend product chasing a moment. It is an 80-year-old solution that has simply, finally, been given a smaller trim size. But a shape surviving 80 years is one thing. Understanding why it survives is another. Picture an egg. Press down on the top of the shell with your thumb, and it holds. Press against the flat end, and it cracks almost instantly. The difference is not the material. The shell is the same thickness all the way around. The difference is the shape. A curve distributes force continuously along the whole structure instead of concentrating it at any single point. And that is why arch bridges have outlasted flat ones for thousands of years, long before anyone had the vocabulary of modern engineering to explain why. It is the same principle the Navy was leaning on in 1941, whether or not the men bolting the ribs together ever thought of it in those terms. Now, picture a sheet of paper lying flat across two stacked books. Lay a pencil across the middle, and the paper sags through immediately. Fold that same sheet lengthwise into a sharp ridge, and lay the pencil across it again. It holds. Nothing about the paper changed except its shape. The corrugation adds stiffness in two directions at once without adding a single gram of material. A mini Quonset transfers its roof load down those corrugated steel ribs to the foundation continuously along the curve, without needing a single support column standing in the middle of the room. The shell is not covering a structure. The shell is the structure. Now consider what happens inside a conventional wall, at every wooden stud, which conducts heat the way a straw conducts water. In a standard 2x6 wall, those studs appear roughly every 16 inches across the entire exterior, and at each one, the insulation layer is interrupted. Heat moves through those vertical stripes of framing from the warm interior to the cold exterior with almost no resistance. Building scientists call this thermal bridging, and it is not a rounding error. Research out of Oak Ridge National Laboratory found it can cut the real-world thermal performance of a well-insulated stud wall by as much as 30% below its rated value on paper. A mini Quonset has none of that. The curved interior surface accepts rigid foam board or spray foam in one continuous, unbroken layer running from floor to ridge. There is no framing hidden inside the wall to interrupt it, no vertical stripe of conduction bleeding heat out all winter long. On paper, that is a physics lesson. In a real build, in a real county, it turns into a number, and that number is where the theory either holds up or falls apart. Take one documented case. A man in rural Montana, 10 by 16 feet of footprint. A mini Quonset shell raised over a single weekend. Rigid foam insulation lining the interior curve. A salvage exterior door pulled from a Habitat for Humanity restore in Missoula. A pier foundation built from 12 cinder blocks. A basic off-grid electrical system wired in by hand. Total material cost, start to finish, $2,740. Name the state, name the footprint, name the total, and the number holds up. The $600 entry price covers the shell panels only and nothing more. Delivery from most manufacturers adds $200 to $600 depending on distance. A cinder block pier foundation runs $80 to $150 in materials. Rigid foam board sufficient to line a 10 by 16 interior costs $200 to $350 at retail, and considerably less when sourced from the cutoff bins at an active commercial job site, which generate usable foam board scrap in quantity almost every week. Add it up the way the man in Montana did, and a livable, insulated structure built by someone sourcing materials with a little patience lands between $1,800 and $3,500. Read that again. A livable, insulated shell, 1 weekend of assembly, under $3,500 total. No welding, no crane, no specialized trade standing between you and a finished wall. That number is still less than the deposit alone on production tiny home, and it was reached by one man with a truck, a weekend, and a willingness to call around for salvage material instead of paying retail for every board. One build could be luck. One man with the right restore connection, the right weekend, the right weather. It is not. And once you see how many other people arrived at the same number, in places that have never spoken to each other, luck stops being a plausible explanation. a housing outreach coordinator in Ravalli County, Montana, documented 3 separate owner-built arch structures on private rural land within a 40-mile radius. 3 different men, no prior construction experience between them, and none of them had ever had any contact with each other. No shared forum, no group chat, no mutual acquaintance passing along a set of plans. Each one had independently arrived at the same surplus kit sourcing pipeline, the same rigid foam salvage method pulled from job site scrap-ins, and the same county permit threshold research, as if 3 people had solved the same equation separately and landed on an identical answer. A social worker in rural Lemhi County, Idaho, described the same convergence happening a state away. Men learning the complete foundation and assembly process from conversations at food bank distribution lines and Saturday church breakfasts. Hand-drawn wiring diagrams passed from one person to the next on notebook paper, redrawn and corrected as they moved down the line. Nobody filmed a tutorial. Nobody wrote a manual. The knowledge spread the way survival knowledge has always spread, person to person, need to need. That is not a coincidence, and it is not a trend either. A trend needs marketing, a hashtag, someone selling something. This had none of that. 3 men in Montana who never spoke to each other, and a separate cluster in Idaho arriving at the same conclusions through nothing but food bank lines and church breakfasts. That is not a fad catching on. That is a pattern surfacing independently in places with nothing connecting them except the same problem and the same 80-year-old answer, sitting in the same surplus listings, which raises the obvious question. If the math works this consistently, and the pattern keeps repeating itself in places that have never talked to each other, why isn't everyone doing this already? The honest answer is not flattering to the people selling the $600 figure loan, and it starts with what that number leaves out. Because I want to be straight with you, and being straight with you is the whole point. The $600 figure is real. It is the current entry price of the smallest production mini Quonset model from several active manufacturers, and it covers the corrugated steel arch panels, the ridge ribs, and the fasteners. That is all it covers. It does not cover delivery, a foundation, insulation, a door, or any system for water, power, or cooking. A finished, livable structure built by someone's source of materials with a little patience costs between $1,800 and $3,500. That is still remarkable. But anyone telling you that you can move into one for $600 is not accounting for the full build. And you deserve better than that kind of math. The arch is also not a house in the conventional sense, and pretending otherwise does nobody any favors. The interior floor area of a 10 by 12 model runs approximately 120 square feet, enough for one person and a functional set of systems, arranged with intention, workable for 2 people who plan the layout carefully and are not expecting a hallway, not a family home. Anyone presenting it as one is selling you something you should not buy. Moisture management is not optional. An uninsulated or poorly vapor-sealed arch, in any climate with seasonal humidity, will develop condensation on the interior steel surface within a single season. That condensation does not stay on the surface. It destroys insulation with finishes and anything fabric inside the structure within a year, quietly, from the inside out. A 50-foot roll of 6 mil plastic sheeting costs $20 at any hardware store. Staple it to the interior framing before the insulation goes up, and it prevents the problem entirely. Skip it, and a great build becomes a failed one before the first real winter is even over. The homework is what keeps this honest. And the next obstacle has nothing to do with foam board or vapor barriers at all. It is sitting behind a desk in a county office, and it does not care how good your math is. Consider what happens when a man walks into a rural county permit office with plans for a mini Quonset he intends to occupy as a primary residence. The clerk behind the counter has approved hundreds of stick frame sheds, a handful of manufactured home placements, and a small stack of conventional accessory dwelling builds. He has never once seen an arch form submitted as a dwelling. What follows is not a rejection. It is friction, and friction moves slower than any outright no ever would. Most rural county codes exempt structures under 120 to 200 square feet from the permitting process entirely, provided they are not connected to municipal utilities. A 10 by 12 mini Quonset at 120 square feet falls inside that threshold in most jurisdictions across Texas, Montana, and Tennessee. But the exemption language was written with storage sheds in mind, not with anyone's bedroom in mind. And whether a structure inside that threshold can be legally inhabited depends entirely on how one individual inspector chooses to read language that was never written to answer that question. The financing gap is worse. A lender wants a permanent foundation, a recognized residential designation, and comparable sales nearby to justify the loan. A corrugated steel arch resting on cinder block satisfies none of those boxes under any conventional underwriting standard. No amount of documented performance changes what the form asks for. Then there is the appraiser. In 2022, a rural workforce housing initiative in Blaine County, Idaho, placed a series of owner-built arch structures on private land as part of a county pilot program. The appraiser assigned to evaluate them had no comparable arch sales anywhere in the county database. So he valued each one against conventional stick-built storage sheds because that was the only category the system recognized. Years of occupancy, documented energy performance, and verified structural integrity were worth nothing in that comparison. The system had no box to put them in. Nobody designed this to exclude the arch. They just left the default exactly where it always was. And that single fact changes the entire question you should be asking next. So, is a mini Quonset illegal to live in? Here is the honest answer, and it is more useful than the myth. No. There is no building code in the United States that prohibits a corrugated steel arch structure, and there is no federal regulation that bars occupancy of one. In rural jurisdictions where the footprint falls below the permit exemption threshold, and the structure is not connected to municipal utilities, a man can place a properly insulated, vapor-sealed arch on a pier foundation with landowner permission and occupy it legally without a permit, a mortgage, or a building inspector stamp anywhere in the process. The resistance is not legal. It is institutional. An inspector hesitates not because a written code bars the arch, but because he has approved 10,000 stick frame walls and perhaps 2 arch structures in his entire career. A lender declines not because the law requires it, but because his underwriting template simply has no feel for a corrugated steel dwelling on a pier foundation. An appraiser reaches for the shed comparison not because he is wrong, but because comparable arch sales do not exist anywhere in his database. The nearest familiar category wins by default. That is friction, and friction, unlike a prohibition, is something you can plan around. Here is what you can actually do with that. First, contact manufacturers directly and get a delivered price quoted to your actual address, because transport from the nearest distribution point can equal the kit cost itself in remote counties. Second, call your county planning office before you purchase anything and ask 3 questions in order. Whether your planned square footage requires a permit, whether it must be tied to utilities to qualify for the exemption, and whether the county restricts human occupancy of non-permitted accessory structures on private land. Third, solve the land question before the structure question, because an arch shell sitting in a storage yard is not a home. Fourth, budget for insulation from day one. The foam board and the vapor barrier are fixed costs, and neither is negotiable. Fifth, if you ever intend to sell or refinance, document everything and hand that documentation to the appraiser before he reaches for the wrong category himself. Picture 2 green corrugated arches on a wood deck at the edge of a spruce forest, doors open, warm light spilling out across the interior shelving, a sleeping area just out of frame. That structure was not financed by a bank. It was not approved by a planning committee. It was bolted together on a piece of ground by someone who decided that the default was a choice, not a requirement. The moment you see the default for what it is, you are no longer trapped by it. If cutting costs, building smarter, and depending a little less on systems that were never built with your situation in mind is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing is the simplest way to make sure the next one of these finds you.